So this week we looked at John chapter 11, where Christ raises Lazarus from the dead. And even more importantly, he makes that statement, I am the resurrection and the life. So it's a big passage with a lot of good stuff in there. I want to zero in on verses 21 through 27 of John chapter 11. And these are also the verses that the life groups are going to be focusing on this week. And so I'm going to be going through some of the life group questions and just sort of making some observations. So whether or not you go to a life group, I hope you'll find this interesting if you want to study a little bit more. So let's read the passage first. So the context is that Lazarus is dead. He has two sisters, Martha and Mary. Jesus shows up, and Mary and Martha are going to be talking with him, and we're going to be looking at his discussion more with Martha. So let's look at the passage. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. And so let's go through there. So in verse 21, Jesus shows up and Martha makes this statement. And so here's what she says. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And so one of my questions is this, is that a complaint or is it a statement of faith or is it both? So is it a complaint like, Lord, where were you? If you had been here, none of this would have happened. Or is it also a statement of faith? Because she's saying in a sense that if Jesus was there, he did have the ability to keep this from happening. So obviously she believes some things were true about Jesus and who he was and what he'd be able to do, the power that he had, that if he was there, this thing wouldn't have happened in the first place. So one of the life group questions is just about that. Is it a complaint, a statement of faith? Why did she think that if Jesus was there, her brother would not have died? Given her statement, what is it that she might have believed about Jesus? So that's the first statement she makes. But then verse 22 definitely seems to be a statement of faith. She says this, but I know that even now, it's like even now, and the fact that my brother's dead, even now, God will give you whatever you ask. So that's one of the questions that are in there. Given that her brother was dead, how does that statement in verse 22 show faith? What might she thought that Jesus would do? Like even now, God will give you whatever you ask. What did she think that maybe perhaps Jesus would ask of God? So she makes a statement in verse 21. She makes a statement in verse 22. Jesus then replies in verse 23, and he said to her, so Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. So Jesus makes this statement, and then what's Martha's response in verse 24? She says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Now, Jesus says, your brother will rise again, and Martha, she goes immediately to, well, yeah, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So the life group question is this, why might she have thought that Jesus' statement in verse 23 was pointing to a future event? So Jesus just simply said he'll rise again. She's connecting the word rise again with some distant event called the resurrection. So when she heard that phrase rise again, it didn't seem like she thought, oh great, he's going to come back to life again in the next 10 minutes, that this was Jesus pointing to something off in the future. So why might she have believed that? So that's one of the questions, just kind of something to think about there. So she makes a statement about the resurrection in verse 24. I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And then in verse 25, Jesus makes a declaration about himself. Jesus said, I am the resurrection. So in verse 24, Martha uses the word resurrection. She goes, oh yeah, the resurrection in the last day. And then Jesus doesn't redefine that, but in a sense, he redefines it. He says, I am the resurrection. And so what is the connection between how Christ uses the word resurrection in verse 25 and how Mary used the word resurrection in verse 24? So I am the resurrection and the life. So one of my questions is this, is the resurrection a person? Is it an event? Is it both? If it's a person and an event, how are those two things connected to each other? So I'm the resurrection and the life. And then in verse 25, Jesus says, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. So that word believe is important. So if you want to live, you need to believe in Jesus Christ. And then but look at how it ends. It says, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. So it seems to say, hey, good news as a Christian, you're going to live even though, kind of on this planet, you're going to die at some point. But then in verse 26, so let's look at verse 26, he says, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? So on the one hand, verse 25 seems to imply we're going to die, that we'll live even though we die. And verse 26 says, whoever lives and believes in me will never die. So do Christians die? So when Jesus says that whoever believes in me will never die, does that mean a Christian won't experience death? What does it mean that we'll never die? So Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And then he asks a question. And the question is this: do you believe this? So he's asking her if she believes something. He's asking her, do you believe this? And so one of my questions is, what is the this? Like, what is it specifically that Jesus is asking her whether or not she believes? Like, what part of that sentence? Or is it all of that sentence? And if you look at that sentence and you break down the sentence, like, what are some of the things in there that we're called to believe? So Jesus makes some statements. He makes statements about who he is. I am the resurrection and the life. And so apparently I'm supposed to believe some things about who Jesus is. Jesus makes a statement about whoever believes in him will live. So I guess that's something I'm supposed to believe. And if I believe and live in him, I'll never die. So like, as you're thinking about that, verses 25 through 26, what are the things that are listed in there? What are some of the different things I'm supposed to believe about who Jesus is and what Jesus has said? So that'd be a question, because he asked her, do you believe this? And then in verse 27, she makes a declaration. She says this: yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, comma, the Son of God, comma, who was to come into the world. And so one of the life group questions we have is, what is it that she's saying in verse 27? What does she say in verse 27 about Jesus? So what does that verse teach us about Jesus? What does that verse teach us about believing in Jesus, who he is? What does that verse teach us about placing our faith in Christ? So kind of as you go through verse 27, the different things she points out. So she says, yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ. So what does it mean to be the Christ? Comma, the Son of God. What does it mean to be the Son of God? Who is to come into the world? So we know from John chapter 3 that God so loved the world, he sent his one and only son. So what is it that she seems to understand about Jesus, and what is it that she believes about Jesus? And how does that answer connect to the question? So Jesus said some things about himself in verse 25 and 26. He says, do you believe this? Then her response is, I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Now, Jesus in verses 25 through 26 didn't specifically use the word Christ, Son of God, who is to come into the world. He says, I'm the resurrection and life. So how does her response connect and enhance this statement that Jesus says about who he is? And not that she enhances it, but just that we get a fuller picture of who Jesus Christ is. So in this passage, he's the resurrection, he's alive, he's the Son of God, he's the Christ who is to come into the world. And so verse 27 makes some statements about who Jesus Christ is. In fact, the word believe it's used a whole bunch of times in the overall passage. If you go from John chapter 11, verses 1 all the way through verse 45, and you look at how many times the word believe and or believes and or believed, like it's in past tense, or put their faith, and that's one of the life group questions, just to go through the whole passage and find out how many times the word believe and put your faith is used in there. But if you just look at verses 25 through 26, the word believe is used 3 times. So Jesus said to her, I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And so this passage talks about who Christ is, and it's a call to place our faith in Christ. And in this passage, Jesus calls Martha to place her faith in him. Do you believe this? And she makes a declaration of faith. Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. So whether or not you go to a life group, if you want to take some time to go through those life group questions and take a look particularly here at the verses we just covered, John chapter 11, verses 21 through 27, that'd be a good opportunity just to learn more about Jesus Christ.